Hi guys, so in today's video I'm going to be talking about my response to the Netflix show The Man with 1,000 Kids. I've been getting quite a few messages, comments on here and on Instagram from people asking me if A, I've seen the show, and B, what my thoughts on it are. So I thought it was probably best to give it its own video rather than me try and talk about this in and amongst other things on another video. And kind of share my thoughts and feelings now that I've had a chance to watch it, had a chance to kind of think about it over a couple of days, and just share my thoughts and opinions with you guys. Just before we go any further, it is currently a cloudy day today, which means the sun's going in and out, so I'm going to alternate between looking a little bit yellow and a little bit pale, but I can't be bothered to dig out my ring light right now, so we're just gonna have to deal with that. Oh, I've just realised that I've angled this camera for me sitting on my knees, but there's no way I can do that for 20-30 minutes, however long this video is, so I'm gonna have to reset the camera angle. Right, first of all, if you haven't watched the show yet and you're wanting to and you don't want any spoilers, then I'd recommend going and watching that first before we go into this video, because I'm going to go into detail about some of the points that they raise. If you have watched it already, or if you haven't watched it but you are not sure whether you want to watch it, and particularly if you are a parent of a donor-conceived child, then keep on watching. I'll go into a little bit of detail around some of the topics and whether or not I think it's worth watching. So the show is basically about a prolific sperm donor, a guy who essentially misleads both people he meets in real life, people he does what we call known donation for, so women that he will kind of meet on the internet who are looking for a sperm donor, but also sperm banks too. So he's donated through both routes. He donates both to people in person through known donation and also through anonymous donation through a sperm bank, although he is happy to have contact with his children in the future when they get older. He has made it clear he's happy to be what we call a non-anonymous donor through a sperm bank, which means when a child who's conceived using that sperm donor reaches 18, they can then access identifying information. In some countries it's a bit earlier, it's at 16. So basically this guy's mission is to father as many children as possible, and as I said, he does this through two routes of donation. So by donating to people who contact him directly through sort of online known donor sperm sites, and also by donating to sperm banks. But he deceives both groups of people. So when he was donating in person, he would tell the women that he was donating to that he was only planning to donate to sort of 5 families, and that would be his limit. And he was telling the sperm banks that he was going to that he was only donating to them. So you have to sign a form to say that you're only going to donate to them. But actually, in practice, legally, it's not really enforceable. It's just like a best practice thing that they say you shouldn't donate elsewhere. But he donated to, as far as we know, I think around 11 sperm banks. That's quite worrying, and I'll get onto that a little bit later. But kind of focusing for now on how it starts out in the episodes, they meet a number of the women that he donated to in person, both through having sex, which sometimes is called natural insemination, and through what's called AI, but not the AI we think of now, but artificial insemination. So when he basically donates, ejaculates into a cup, and then people put the sperm inside themselves. So you meet a few of the families that he started out doing this for, and essentially the series follows along as they discover just how many half-siblings their children have, and start to realise actually he clearly has donated to many, many more than he says. So the donor that they're talking about in this programme is a guy called Jonathan Jacob Meyer, and he is Dutch, and primarily the families that they interview in this show are from the Netherlands, but there is one Australian couple too. And what they go through is the kind of process of each of them finding out how many kids that they have and whereabouts in the world they are, and also focusing on the fact that this guy had, and still has actually to this day, a YouTube channel where he kind of travels the world and talks about all these different places he's been. And as they put the pieces together about how he's traveling and donating in probably all of these places in his attempt to kind of spread his seed everywhere. Now, it is a difficult watch, I think, and there are definitely parts of it that are very disturbing, but as someone who has a donor-conceived child, I am pleased that I did watch it, because I think it's really important to be informed about what's going on in the donor conception world, and also because I think this show really highlights the need for change within like the sperm banks, in terms of them being better connected globally. So just to separate out the two types of donation he did, the known donation and the sperm bank, focusing on the known donation part for now. So quite a few of the couples that they interview in this show used him as a known donor. So they found him through online websites where they were looking for sperm donors, and they wanted to meet them in person to kind of get a better understanding of who they were, which I think is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. However, when it comes to known donation, where you either use a family friend or somebody who you meet online, there is a whole legal grey area. So I can't speak for other countries, but in the UK, if you use a known sperm donor, even if you have agreed with them that they are just going to be a sperm donor, you get a written agreement of some kind between you that they are just going to donate to you. If after you have a baby with that donor, they change their mind, they can go to court and get parental rights if they really want to. It is something that they can do. And you don't really have any opportunity to have a say in, to be able to say, no, actually, I want this person to be a donor. I don't want them to be involved in my child's life. If they change their mind, that is not something you have control over. However, if you go down the sperm donor through a sperm bank route, a sperm donor cannot ever do that. That was one of the biggest things for me in going down the sperm bank route as opposed to using a known donor, was the fact that they could potentially change their mind and claim parental rights. I have seen it happen once or twice before, so it's not unheard of. One of the things that I think this program really did highlight was the fact that if you do want to use a donor who you've kind of met in person, that actually, even if you're kind of really trying to look deep to their background, even if you get them to do an STI check or whatever, there's still a lot of unknowns there, because you cannot ever you have to rely a lot on someone telling you the truth. And this show really demonstrated how that trust can be broken very easily. However, to a certain extent, there's not much you can do about that, because you can't, someone can choose to donate or have sex with multiple people and have loads of babies, and there's very little that you can actually do to regulate that, if that's the only way that they're donating. However, the bit that really disturbed me and worried me about this show was when it came to the sperm bank side of things. For me, the bit about the sperm banks that was really disturbing was the fact that this guy potentially donated to, well, I think they said he donated to 11 sperm banks just in Holland alone, one of which being Cryos, which is a really big sperm bank and ships sperm, internationally as well. And that's how the Australian couple that they interviewed ended up with him as their donor. The fact that even within one country, they didn't have a system clever enough to track the fact that this donor was already registered somewhere else. And that in turn means that in the future, when these children grow up, because if you donate to different sperm banks, like sperm banks basically, if they're putting a donor online, they don't use the donor's real name. They use either an alias, so a made-up name, or they use a number. But they won't use the same one between different sperm banks. So you might end up with somebody who has been conceived using a particular sperm donor, and then they grow up and they're like, okay, this is the name of my donor, but they have donor siblings that were conceived through another bank, but they have different names, so they don't know how to communicate with each other. That's one of the things that was really worrying to me, because I think one of the things that's so important for kids is to be able to connect with their donor siblings, particularly as they start growing up. It's not just about them being able to contact their donor in the future, which the bank would have the same contact details for the donor, but knowing their half siblings. That is something that is very important to a lot of donor conceived people. And if you've got someone who's donated to multiple banks and those families haven't sought out the donor, then there's no way for them to have sought out finding the donor. Then there's no way for those kids to communicate with each other. So that was really worrying. But then there's the fact that he also travelled overseas to donate to other sperm banks. And in the video, they focus in particular on a sperm bank in Kenya, which is really keen to have European sperm donors. And they essentially want to aim for about 200 babies per sperm donor, which is a huge amount. In the UK, for example, we have the HFEA, which is the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Association, I think, and they have a family limit of 10. So in the UK, you can only have 10 families conceived using one donor, and at that point, the donor is no longer allowed to be used in the UK. But that limit only applies in the UK. So this Dutch donor, for example, who has like possibly, they were saying, up to 3,000 children, has been used in the UK, and he reached his family limits here. And so there's probably about 10, probably more, if we're being honest, families that have been conceived using his sperm here. But actually, like, even though they were told a 10 family limit, there's still thousands potentially of other half siblings out in the world, because those limits don't apply worldwide. And the other thing you have to remember is that because he was donating in person, it's very possible that he did no donation in the UK. So there's more than 10 families using his sperm. And on top of that, if you use a donor, if you go overseas to have treatment, the donor you use then is not necessarily counted in the UK numbers. So for example, if you look up now a donor that you want to use on, say, a sperm bank, and they say, oh, the family limit's been reached in the UK, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't use that donor. It just means you need to go to a country where he hasn't reached his family limit yet, which might be, you know, Denmark, for example. A lot of people go and have treatment in Denmark because it's a lot cheaper. And when you do that, your children are then not counted in the numbers for the UK figures, because the HVA can only monitor people that have treatment in the UK, because you have to pay for a pregnancy slot if you have treatment here. You don't if you go abroad. So that's another flaw to the system. So this show is essentially about these families using him as a donor and then finding out just how many children he is having. And they get to a point where they decide that they have to do something to get him to stop, because he's never going to stop on his own. And they take him to court in the Netherlands, and they win. They persuade the judge that she needs to put an order in to stop him from donating, and the judge does that and basically says that if he continues to donate, for every donation, I think it's for every donation, he will be fined €100,000. So it's a lot of money. It's also quite historic, because I believe it's the first time that a man has ever had his reproductive rights infringed upon through a court. So my thoughts and feelings on it. Well, first of all, I think it really highlighted the need that we have to have much tighter international regulations when it comes to sperm donation. How that would be done, I don't know. And this is what makes it so tricky, is because of like the fact that sperm banks can ship sperm between them, and how you regulate that more strictly is one challenge. The other is the fact that we need a much better interconnectedness between sperm banks to make sure that a donor is not donating at multiple banks, because they have to, when sperm donors donate, they do have to give their details to the sperm bank, because you have to show like your ID and proof that you're not fraudulent, etc. You can't just walk in there and give a fake name. So the fact that they didn't communicate properly between themselves, and there wasn't a system like nationally that could recognize, nationally or internationally, where they could spot that a donor is doing this, is trying to donate multiple times, that's something that obviously I think urgently needs to be addressed. I think it also highlighted the need for donor-conceived siblings, so half siblings where different families have used the same donor, to be able to connect through a more official system earlier. We don't have that in the UK. There are ways around it where people like have Facebook groups, and there's like the donor sibling registry and stuff where you can kind of like register your donor and go and find if other people have used the same donor and if they're also looking for their siblings, and then you can connect that way. But there's no official way to do it in the UK where you can register with the HVA, and they can tell you how many children have been conceived using the same donor, but they can't give you any contact details. There's no system which people can even just opt into to be connected to donor siblings, and I think that's something that definitely needs to change. It's something that's highlighted in this show particularly because there are so many children conceived using this man's sperm that the risk of one of the children potentially meeting and partnering up with their half sibling in the future is massive. So accidental incest is a really big worry when you have that many children conceived using one donor, and that is why family limits are placed in places like the UK to try and reduce that chance of happening, because it's obviously devastating if you grow up and you fall in love with someone and then you find out that you're half siblings. So that was important. That's why the limits are important and why there needs to be more international regulation around this. But it was also why being connected to siblings earlier is important, because we know if you are not raised with your sibling and you grow up and you meet a half sibling having never known them before, you are automatically likely to be more attracted to them because you see certain features and similarities. And that it's a well-known phenomenon. It has a name which I now can't remember, but that's why it's so important to meet them early, and that's why we really do need a system to connect donor siblings at an earlier age so they can grow up together, seeing each other, and that scenario doesn't happen. So one of the biggest challenges I think around this topic when we talk about donor conception and having tighter family limits within the sperm banks and tighter regulations is when it comes to cost, because it is already very expensive to use a sperm donor, and that's with the sperm banks basically setting their own limits, as well as like the country limits and buying a pregnancy slot. It's already like really expensive to use a sperm donor. I think one vial or one straw of sperm at the moment is around £1,000, which is very expensive. And if you think about like how many attempts it might take you to get pregnant and how many straws of sperm you might need, the costs can very quickly rack up. And if we put even tighter regulations onto the sperm banks with regards to how many children can be conceived using one particular donor, particularly if we're talking about worldwide limits, then that is ultimately going to push the cost of donor sperm up. That's going to potentially cause more issues as well, because A, as we've said before, using a sperm donor through a sperm bank is already very expensive. B, if it gets even more expensive, you're potentially going to push more people out of the kind of regulated clinic route into the known donation, finding people online to be sperm donor route, which, as we proved in this program, is very difficult, if not almost impossible, to regulate, because people can meet others, and people always find ways to connect and meet up. And find donors and do this if they need to. So the last thing you want to do really is to push more people into going down that route, because as we saw, this guy was donating to both sperm banks and people in person, and that's how he managed to have so many. He still managed to have hundreds of children. He has about five or 600 children that he knows of, and that's just through known donation times that he's donated in person to families. The thousands of children that he hasn't met who've been conceived through sperm banks, he doesn't even know them yet. And he's donated multiple times to multiple sperm banks, but he still managed to have hundreds of children just through known donation. So that's the bit that's really difficult to regulate. And that's what I think makes this so difficult, because you need to be able to regulate it more thoroughly, but you also need it to be affordable for people to go down the regulated route so that they're not pushed into the unregulated routes. So I do think this program has raised a lot of questions and a lot of things that need looking into a bit more closely, a lot of things for governments and regulatory departments to look into. But ultimately, it's a very difficult area to do any sort of regulation on, because as they talked about in the show, ultimately this came down to regulating an individual's right to procreate. That's how they had to do it, and they had to do it by saying that it would cause harm to his current children for him to have more because of the risk of them in the future, and also the emotional and social risks of knowing you have thousands of siblings out there who you're never going to meet all of, which is really sad. On a personal level, the thing that worried me most when I watched this program was the fact that this guy was not alone in his desires and his thinking of trying to have thousands of children. They interviewed, well, not in person, but they got a response from a couple of other kind of super donors who were donors that are trying to have many, many children with many, many people. One of whom was incredibly racist. Horrific comment that he left. And so that worry initially to me was thinking, what if the donor that I used was like this? Fortunately for me, my donor had a few kind of combinations of things that made him a little bit unique. I did actually go after the program had finished and look at a couple of the other sperm banks that are kind of in the UK and Europe to see if there were any other donors on there that had same sort of characteristics, and I couldn't find any, thank God. Also, there is another factor to the donor that I chose that I think will make him a little bit less popular with other people. Like there are some donors that you look at and you know that they are going to just like instantly sell out as soon as any donations are topped up. People buy them and they get snapped up and they're out of stock really quickly, and that has not been the case with my donor. Whenever he's had stock, it has gone down, like other people have bought it, but it's never like rapidly depleted, and so that makes me think that it's unlikely that he could be a donor like this. And also he doesn't update, his donations don't top up that regularly. That was something interesting to learn about the show, actually. They talked about how the sperm donor, the donations kind of got replenished monthly on the website when they were checking the Cryos site, and they could see them like regenerating monthly. I didn't use Cryos, but that definitely has not been the case with my donor. He definitely doesn't top up that quickly. So the chances of it happening to anybody is quite rare. These are not the majority of donors that do this. This is, you know, a few bad eggs and bad apples. And I think the chance of it happening with my donor is slim. But I have to be honest and say, like, I don't know. And there is always that slim possibility. And yeah, it is worrying. And I definitely want the governments around the world to take this more seriously and to look into tighter regulation for the sake of our children. So yeah, that's kind of a mixture of my thoughts and opinions on it, having watched the series. I do think, as I said before, I do think it is worth watching if you have a donor-conceived child, because I think it's important to be aware of everything that's kind of going on in the world, and if they grow up and they find out about it and they have questions, you're able to kind of answer them and talk about what you saw and everything. Ultimately, like day to day, it's not something I worry about too much. Like I said, at this point, it's kind of out of my hands. I think we definitely, as I've said many times, need stricter rules around this, and donor conception is not going anywhere. Like, that's the thing. People can object to it all they want, but it's not going anywhere. And if you take it out of like the legal routes through clinics, people just go online and they do it other ways. And that way is clearly, as we've shown, in many ways more dangerous, and people are just as able to exploit them. So yeah, that's my view, or like kind of like a mix of my thoughts and opinions having watched the show. Ultimately, donor conception isn't going anywhere. And there are issues with it which we need to address and that need to be sorted out, but you're never going to stop donor conception. As this show showed, if people don't go down the traditional like sperm donor through a clinic route, they go through the known donation route, which is in many ways more challenging to legislate or to regulate in any way, shape or form, and also is in many ways easier to deceive people by than the clinic route. So actually what we need is a way for sperm donors to go through clinics, and for there to be stricter regulations and checks for them in order to allow people to A, be able to afford to use sperm donors that way, but also B, tighter limits on the number of children that can be conceived worldwide using one donor, and also better interconnectedness between sperm banks so that donors don't go and donate to multiple banks and in their aims to kind of populate the planet. So yeah, a lot to mull over, a lot to think over. Plenty of issues raised, things that need to be discussed and things that need to be addressed. But yeah, hopefully we are on the right paths, at least in the UK, to getting there. And we will find solutions to problems. Anyway, thank you so much for watching, guys. Let me know your thoughts. If you watched the show, do you have a donor-conceived child or not? Are you considering going down donor conception? Anything around that. But thanks so much for watching, everyone. Please subscribe, and I will see you next week. Bye, guys. I hope you have a great day.